Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today we'll be taking a look at caster mobility and look at the different options that each caster has available to them. When I say caster, I mean our ranged magical DPS jobs and not our healers. Those are pretty different compared to our casters. So this video will only be talking about Red Mage, Summoner, and Black Mage. Now, I think the main reason why I was inspired to make this video is because I sometimes say that Black Mage can be more mobile than Red Mage in certain scenarios, and some people get a bit confused when I say that. So I hope that by the end of the video, you will have a better understanding of how each caster's mobility skills work and how they also influence the DPS rotation, because the rotation will often eat some of these movement skills as well, or make it harder to be mobile in certain scenarios, like for example a Black Mage during their ley lines or a Red Mage's melee combo, but we'll get there when we get there. When I talk about being mobile, I mainly refer to the instant cast abilities that the three jobs have access to. I'm not talking about a Red Mage being able to gap close and backflip, or a Black Mage being able to use ethereal manipulation to jump to a teammate or between the lines to jump back to their ley lines. If either of these jobs want to make use of these movement skills, then they still need to have an instant cast ability ready, or they will still clip and suffer a damage loss, which is why it's these instant abilities that I will be talking about today. So let's get started with Red Mage, because this one is the most simple. Feels like most people look at Red Mage as being the most mobile caster, and it is mostly correct. If we're looking at how often Red Mage can move, then it is indeed the most mobile, because every time they cast a skill, the next one will be instant because of the dual cast passive. Now, outside of this, Red Mage doesn't really have much. We still have Swift Cast, but every caster has access to that, and then we have Reprise. That's it. Normally you get a few free usages of Reprise every manification cycle, but you also can't use it too often, or you might start delaying or even losing a melee combo over the course of a fight, which you of course don't want to have happen. But because the mobility of Red Mage is so tied to the dual casting mechanic, you will need to use Reprise when there is no time to get that one cast off, or for example if dual cast plus Swift Cast is not enough. As long as there are no long periods of movement needed and you have the time to proc that dual cast between each necessary movement, then Red Mage is indeed up there as a very mobile caster. But once a scenario presents itself where you need to stay on your feet for a little while, you might have to resort to using Reprise a few times, and that could lead to a damage loss if you have to use it too often. Another thing about Red Mage is the melee combo. This will force you into melee range, and while you can move about freely during this combo, you still need to make sure that you can be close to the boss, as that can sometimes be awkward depending on mechanics. But that also depends on your team composition. If you're playing with triple ranged, then you can just act as the second melee, and then there are usually no issues. But if you're playing double melee already, then having that fifth person around the boss could sometimes lead to very tight positioning, depending on the mechanics that are going on, of course, because if there are no mechanics going on, then there is no issue over there. Moving on to Black Mage, this one is usually looked at as the complete opposite of Red Mage, as the immobile caster, or the turret that just wants to stand still and never move. Now, this used to be much more so the case in previous expansions, but the current version of Black Mage actually has a lot of options available to itself. The only big difference is that a lot of this movement needs to be prepared in advance, so it's a lot more important to know when you will need to move so that you can save one of your skills for that. But Black Mage will often also use these skills for DPS or rotational reasons as well, so you will need to learn when it is possible to use these skills for damage and when you should keep them for movement. So what do we have available? Well, first of all, we have Triple Cast. When used, your next three casted abilities will become instant, so it is possible to use other instants during this buff and it won't eat away at the stacks that you can use. This is a perfect example of a movement tool that you want to use on cooldown for damage, because Black Mage has a lot of skills that have a longer cast time than a recast time, meaning that making these cast times instant will be a DPS gain. Luckily enough, I found that triple cast usually lines up with mechanics anyways, so when I played a lot more Black Mage during the previous raid tier, I didn't find myself having to delay it that often. Beside this, we have procs, Thunder and Fire procs. These can be forced when we use Sharpcast, but it's a little bit RNG dependent. When we have Sharpcast, it's a guaranteed proc, but if we don't have this skill available, then it is just going to be RNG. So your runs will vary depending on how lucky you got. We can use Sharpcast in three ways, basically. Either we use it on Thunder for more damage, we can use it on fire to make our fire phase more comfortable, or you can just use it on cooldown and then it is used on whichever of these two skills you use first. They're all viable decisions that you can make that again might be skewed in a certain direction depending on what the fight requires of you in terms of movement. Our last good movement tool then would be Xenoglossy. There's technically one more, but it's really bad and will often result in a DPS loss, but I'll talk about that afterwards. But Xeno is amazing because it is so versatile. You get 1 stack every 30 seconds, and you can choose to spend it whenever you need it, or save up 2 stacks in total as well. You can use it for movement, you can use it to weaken off global cooldown, you can use it as an extra GCD inside of your ice phase to make sure you get enough mana ticks, or you can save up 2 stacks for when you need them for movement, or you can just use it because it does a lot of damage. It's incredibly versatile. Then the last tool that we have that I just mentioned before is Scathe, but Scathe is really bad. It does very low damage and it also uses MP. It's usually this mana that is required that will make it so that you lose out on a fire forecast during your fire phase. So you basically want to try to avoid using Scathe as much as possible, but if you really have nothing left and you would otherwise just not be casting for a while, then it might be an option for you to use, although you should always try to make sure to use one of the tools that I mentioned before. It's the combination of all of these tools that make Black Mage mobile enough to deal with any fight in the game, although I do feel like Black Mage requires the most practice and experience to get the movement down in a fight. And then of course we still have the ley lines, which make us very immobile as well if we want to make full usage of them. Now, of course, you're not required to be moving all of the time, and when you do need to move, you will most likely have something ready for that. If there is a mechanic that requires you to be on the move for a longer period of time, then Black Mage is able to handle that really well if you're able to save your tools for it. Just imagine having triple cast, 2 Xenos, a proc, swift cast, and maybe by the time that you've used all of that, a 3rd Xeno will be ready. That can just take care of anything in the game, so in that sense is the complete opposite of Red Mage. Red Mage is mobile all of the time, but struggles with longer periods of movement, whereas Black Mage is immobile most of the time, but when prepared enough can easily deal with long stretches of movement. And then we come to our 3rd job, Summoner, or as my friends sometimes like to call it, our 4th ranged DPS. And with this I mean ranged physical, because Summoner has so many movement tools that it might as well have been classified as a ranged instead of a caster. However, just like with Black Mage, some of these instant abilities are going to be linked to your rotation, and you might also not want to make use of everything either, as it might misalign your burst with the rest of the raid buffs. But for the most part, you're free to use these abilities whenever you need them, and will often be using instant casts purely to dumb them for damage purposes, because a lot of your instant cast abilities also are just higher damage abilities than your casted ones. So what do we have? Well, first off we have our 2 trances. While inside either Dreadworm or Fireburst trance, we have a 2.5 second cast time reduction. In other words, all of our spells that aren't Resurrection will become instant. And even for your Resurrection skill, we'll still have that 2.5 second cast time reduction, so you can be faster with resing someone than, for example, your healer if a hard cast res needs to happen. The only thing here is that you will almost never make fully use of your Dreadworm trance. This trance used to give a damage bonus before Shadowbringers, but right now all it does is give you that cast time reduction, and I guess it resets Tri-Disaster as well, but that's not important for today's discussion. So you will often end your trance early to get access to your Bahamut summon, because Bahamut becomes available after you end Dreadworm trance. So you want to sometimes end it early so that your Bahamut can be used during raid buffs. Another thing about Bahamut is that you want to have 4 instant cast abilities ready for it, which would be 3 Ruin 4s and a Swift cast, or just 4 Ruin 4s, but we'll come back on that later when we talk about our other source of instant cast abilities. The Fireburst trance we are going to be using for the full duration, however, so as long as you're not planning on rezzing someone during it, you will have free movement for its whole duration. The second source of our instant abilities comes from our Eggy Assaults. We have 2 of them, Eggy Assault 1 and 2, and they can both stack up to 2 charges, and whenever you use one, it will grant you a Ruin 4 stack, which again stacks up to 4 charges as well. So these again are a lot of instants, because the Eggy Assault themselves is an instant cast ability, and then they also give you that Ruin 4 skill, which again is instant. You'll also want to be using these charges all of the time because you don't want to let them overcap, as they are stronger than your spammable skills. And these eggy assaults also aren't available during your demi summons. So you're already really mobile during your trances, and then when you're not inside of a trance, you have these eggy actions and the Ruin 4 stacks that come with them. There is, however, one instance I mentioned before where you want to save 4 Ruin 4 stacks or 3 Ruin 4 stacks in a swift cast, and that is when you go into your Bahamut summon. Because pets are kind of janky in this game, we want to be using our 4 instant abilities during Bahamut to make sure that we can weave all of our off-global cooldowns and also make sure that Bahamut lands all of his worm waves. But outside of this one phase, you're basically free to use all of these skills whenever you see fit, and you will also be using them very often purely for damage, because you will usually not need all of these stacks for movement or weaving purposes. So this is why myself and most of my caster friends consider Summoner to be the most mobile, as they only really need to care about the Bahamut window, and outside of that they can use their instance for whatever they see fit, and you have way more instance than is needed for movement or weaving only. So if I were to give you a TLDR, it would be as follows. Red Mage is mobile very often, but struggles to deal with longer stretches of movement. If you're able to get one cast off between the movement though, then you will be incredibly mobile. Black Mage is usually very immobile with enough tools to allow you to move every now and then, and if you're able to prepare your resources ahead of time, then you can deal with long stretches of movement fairly easily. And then Summoner is basically a ranged DPS that has so many movement tools that is just not funny. The only thing you have to care about is the Bahamut phase, which is really strict in what it requires to be successful, but outside of the Bahamut phase you are just incredibly mobile and can use your resources on just whatever you want, really. So I hope that now you've reached the end of the video, that you understand the movement capabilities of the casters a bit more, and if the lack of movement skills was something that held you back from trying out one of the casters, that with this information you might feel better about giving it a go. Anyways, that's going to be doing it for me, so I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.